Right. Good evening. As a board member for the South Dakota Humanities Council, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. My name is Joshua Rudnick, and I am from Rapid City, South Dakota. It's been a pleasure sharing all these spaces with you today, and it will be continuing tomorrow. Um, I would like to acknowledge first and foremost that we stand on ground of the Oceti-Sakowee, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. We honor and appreciate the Indigenous people who have the longest relationship to this place. Before we begin tonight's event, a great thank you to the Oscar Larson Performing Arts Center for hosting so many of our festival events. Thank you also to the many volunteers who assist in our planning and staffing. You too can help the festival. First, you can provide us with feedback about this year's event. The link to our online survey is available at sdbookfestival.com. Second, you can keep the help keep the festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. To donate, visit sdhumanities.org or use the slips available at the SDHC information booth. With your gift, you can enter our drawing for a print of our festival guide cover image by Brookings artist Chuck Bennis. Donate 50 for your first entry and $10 for each entry after that. This festival would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have already donated uh, and acknowledged on the back cover of the festival guide. If you are a sponsor of the South Dakota Humanities Council and the Festival of Books, I ask that you please stand and be recognized. Yes. If you have any questions for Ned Blackhawk, we ask that you come to the front in the standing microphones at the end of the aisles when he is ready for Q&A. Finally, I want to mention that Ned's books are available for purchase in the lobby after the presentation. Tonight's program is titled Rediscovering Indigenous American History. Ned Blackhawk, Western Shoshone, is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University, where he serves as a faculty coordinator for the Yale Group for the Study of Native America. A graduate of McGill University, he holds graduate degrees in history from the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Washington. He's the author and co-editor of 4 books of Indigenous history, most recently, The Rediscovery of America, which won the 2023 National Book Award. Please welcome Ned Blackhawk.
Hmm. Thank you, Joshua, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming here on a Friday night to hear something about the rediscovery of America. I haven't been in South Dakota for a very long time, but it's really nice to be back. And I spent the first 10 years of my career at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which isn't too far from here. And I took many trips um, into the Western Great Lakes and also to North Dakota, but haven't been to South Dakota in quite some time. So thank you to all the festival organizers for the invitation to be here. I'm always excited to be participating in any kind of book literacy and festival event, and this is really quite special for me. Sadly, however, I'm also going up against Billy Mills this evening, whom many of you know is also presenting not too far from here. Hopefully, I'll have a chance to catch a glimpse of him throughout the weekend. Today, I'll be discussing my recent book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, which came out last year in 2023. And it's kind of taken on a little bit of a life of its own, um, taking me into places and experiences that really are very uncommon for not just an academic, which I am by training, but also for an academic university press book or title. University presses books are not the most kind of heavily circulated across the publishing world. And it's been really quite an experience as well as joy to see this project do so many kind of unanticipated things. And so tonight I'm happy to share portions of it. It is a kind of, uh, as you may see or potentially feel, a weighty tome that did take a very long time to craft. And it begins with a set of maps, both in the in pages, the front pages, and the um, in pages. What one of my friends who's a literary scholar refers to as the paratext, kind of things that are outside of the text, but also kind of part of it. And if you were to happen to find these maps, you would see for the first time, perhaps, a map of the contiguous United States that has all the federally recognized as well as state recognized Native American nations upon it. And that's right now up on the screen. And this map, which I created with some students, um, as well as the beginning map and the opening pages, these maps make, in a certain sense, the argumentation of the book as a whole. That is, that what we think of as American history or U.S. history has indelible, essential indigenous attributes and dimensions to it. And the central argument of the and some of the opening pages of this book is that it's impossible to understand the course and development of U.S. history outside of this indigenous context. So the bulk of the book uh, is divided into two somewhat sizable parts, each of which are 6 chapters that take us to familiar places, essentially, or subject matters upon the North American historical and U.S. historical landscape. Places like the rise of British North America, other places like the American Revolution, others like the U.S. Constitution or the Civil War, all have kind of substantive chapters um, therein that attempt to essentially intervene into kind of commonplace understandings of what constitutes these subjects and refashion them through an analysis of these subjects through this kind of indigenous lens, we might call it, or through the indigenous context of Native American history. So I'm very kind of proud to have produced these maps, in part because I do live in Eastern North America, where there are, dozens of Native American communities that most Americans never learn about, and even many local and state residents know very little about. So, putting together a kind of visual cartography of this subject is one of the kind of initial kind of encounters one might have with this text. The book's title is drawn from a generation of academic studies, and I guess I stand before you this evening with a message from the Native American historical and indigenous studies world. And that is, there has been such a kind of profound profusion of academic and scholarly and kind of tribal research initiatives over the last generation or so, that this profusion has profoundly unmade many kind of normative assumptions about what constitutes the normative course or the primary chapters of American history. And most of the book, if you're interested, at least in the first half, is an intervention into the study of the U.S. history, U.S. history's what used to be called colonial era, which used to be somewhat synonymous not just with British North America, but particularly New England. And much of early American history used to kind of read like a litany of Puritans, patriots, and presidents. Nice alliteration there for those who pay attention to these things. And now there's a kind of dizzying kind of perspective that has incorporated multiple sets of not just indigenous subjects, but non-Anglophone imperial actors as well. And so the first 6 chapters of this book, in a part one, which is called Indians and Empires, provides some introduction to this profusion of academic and historical scholarship that has begun to refashion. One of the intents of the book as a whole is to bring this kind of understanding together in a singular form, a one volume monograph, what we might call a synthetic interpretive overview, and to do so with this kind of constant commitment to thinking of these subjects in relationship to Native American history. So the rediscovery of America that's in the title is a recognition of this generation or two of scholars who've made it their kind of professional and intellectual and community, often even commitments to refashioning what we think of as American history. And this rediscovery has prioritized what I call the centrality of Native peoples to the making of America. Um, Surprisingly, this is one of the few attempted overviews of Native American history. There have been a couple others in very recent years, and essentially, I'm part of a generation of academic scholars who've now reached the point in their careers and understandings of the field to try to bring it all together, so to speak. The field's incomparable expanse, both temporally, spatially, kind of ethnographically, as we can see even in the screen behind us, has seemingly discouraged broad interpretations of the field and has contributed in part the lack of kind of reference works or kind of informed kind of interpretive engagements has kind of contributed to the often invisibility of this subject to so many American scholars as well as citizens. Today, I'm going to take us, however, not through those kind of normative early American historical experiences. Those are awaiting those who would like to encounter them in the book itself. But I'm going to try to prioritize an engagement with Native American intellectual and community members who began responding to particular understandings of America that they found misguided, harmful, and inadequate. Um, as in the other chapters of the book, this analysis, which comes from the last two chapters of the Rediscovery of America, attempts to move past what I often see as the overdetermined analysis of Indigenous victimization that has often accompanied studies of recent Native American history at times. I emphasize less the power of external actors or national leaders, and more in these chapters the currents of Native American activism, and expose here how after the Civil War, indigenous peoples across the United States responded to and thus refashioned institutions of federal authority that had arrived during what is generally termed the reservation era, which generally is recognized to have begun after the establishment or after the abolishment of the U.S. treaty making processes in the early 1870s, um, and um, and an era that began in somewhat concordance with larger efforts in American society to assimilate American Indians. And so the chapters that precede this subject today recount those policy changes and practices, particularly the alienation of indigenous land holdings, including the subdivision of the Great Sioux Reservation here in South Dakota, as well as the removal of American Indian children to particular off reservation boarding schools, a process that began with federal funding in the 1870s after the opening of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which sought to transform under the leadership of a military leader by the name of Richard Henry Pratt. It sought to transform Native people's most intimate ties by severing the effective bonds between Native children and their families. New laws also targeted, as we were suggesting, communal land holdings. There's actually really under recognized congressional act called the Lakota Act that Congress has passes that helps legitimate the dispossession of the Great Sioux Reservation that I write about um, in the previous chapter. So new laws also targeted these communal land holdings as well as that removed children from their families. Over 75,000 children were removed of federally funded schools, and over 100 million acres of reservation lands became further dispossessed, including the vast majority, as I mentioned already, of the Great Sioux Reservation, which was established by treaty, as we may know, at Fort Laramie, or the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was ratified by the Senate. By 1912, as one congressional law established, Congress had placed Indian communities under their, quote, absolute jurisdiction and control. under a legal doctrine known as congressional plenary power that informs numerous studies of this period as well. So my chapter draws upon this half-century assimilation campaign when a generation of American Indian activists responded to these destructive policies and began working against them in ways that reshaped the contours of federal policy thereafter, particularly during a formative period known as the Indian New Deal, when reformers both reversed assimilation and established new laws that began to establish more forms of cultural autonomy and self-determination. And I started in the late 1800s when new visions of American history proliferated across um, the still young republic. Um, the end of the American Civil War and the 12-year period known as Reconstruction brought extraordinary transformations to the nation. And I was really kind of astonished at how relatively under institutionalized the federal government really was at the time of the Civil War's outbreak. And not quite as astonished afterwards, but really deeply kind of struck by the level of capacity that the federal government developed thereafter. So here's an anecdote that's in the book itself. When Abraham Lincoln was running for the Republican nomination as president, he gave a famous address in Cooper Union, New York. He left Illinois by train, and it took him 4 days to get to New York City because the trains upon which he was traveling were all regional. And I don't know the exact course of it, but as he was traveling, he'd have to get off one gauge to get onto another. And there were not yet bridges across many of the rivers. And so he'd have to take steamboats. And so this kind of sense of unincorporated transportation and infrastructure is really kind of evident, contrasting that trip east that he took with his final trip west, when his coffin was taken across the northern Union states, or most of them, at a slow moving rate of 5 miles an hour. In 1865, after his assassination, he returns to Illinois. And the train stops, or moves, it doesn't stop, it moves at slow rates across the northern Union cities, Cincinnati, um, obviously Chicago, leaving Washington, places in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania that I can't recall, into New York State. And people, young children and many citizens would come out to see their venerable leader heading west for the last time. But the sense of the railroad's completion in the east and its universal gauge development, I think is just, kind of nicely, beautifully encapsulated by the kind of anecdote, which I use in the book to kind of emphasize this transformation that has occurred in the still young republic, particularly because of the war. After the war, the American government begins incorporating Western lands, and in the process, American intellectuals, academics, writers, artists, and many others begin developing theories and understandings of American history that are proliferating across the country. So when the United States holds its first centennial celebration in 1876 to celebrate its 100th birthday in Philadelphia, 10 million people attended. They revel at the majesty of the centennial's visions of the American future, while twice as many will attend or did attend the spectacular White City exposition held in honor of the 400th anniversary of the Columbian arrival, organized on Chicago's waterfront, from which the next three images are taken. In these visions of America, within each centennial monument, within each parade, publications, visions of a confident and certain past deepened across the nation. Indeed, throughout the late 19th century, new mythologies emerged everywhere as citizens celebrated the origins of the Republic and equated its history with progress, if not providence. Even the nation's first professionally trained historians shared in these truisms. They too located the nation's defining characteristics. For example, in the colonial era, and they believed that the settlement of Indian lands formed the basis of America's fulfillment. As I write, in a morality play with foregone conclusions, the United States emerged from the conquest of Indian lands and achieved its destiny through expansion. A broad consciousness, and particularly of what became known as the West, or the American interior, fueled not only the nation's historical production, but also its scholarly infrastructure, which included the establishment of the nation's first historical organization dedicated to American history, known as the Mississippi Valley Historical Association, founded in 1907, which later became the Organization of American Historians, the nation's most widely recognized historical association, which publishes the leading journal of American history known as the Journal of American History. Now, I'm a longtime OAH member, so these are things that we know in certain ways well. Within these studies, as I suggest on our slide, Indians were not simply outside of this vision of American civilization that was forming, but they were antithetical to it. As one famous California historian by the name of Hubert Howe Bancroft would write in a 5-volume series entitled The Native Races, published in 1883, it is only from the study of barbarous nations that we are able to comprehend man as a progressive being. Across the Americas, scholars, at least North America, scholars sought to identify how Native peoples differed from these so-called civilized man. Bancroft would continue to suggest, for example, among the Alutiiq of Kodiak Island, Alaska, their, quote, domestic manners are of the lowest order. They have no idea of morality. They lived, he concluded, simply, quote, in filth. Within this structure of America's racial hierarchy, Native peoples inhabited the lowest rungs, constituting in many ways, as they were organized at this Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, constituting in many ways living object lessons in need of reform. They remain, as many referred to them at the time, as members of a vanishing race. And like the nation, they too shared in a destiny. If they could not assimilate, they were destined to disappear. As an Arizona senator by the name of Carl Hayden at the time argued, Native peoples were, quote, a dying race entitled to little else. So this is the kind of beginnings of this chapter that kind of expose the formation of an ideology of indigenous disappearance and inferiority that I think hasn't been sufficiently engaged or contextualized, because this is the vision of Native Americans that so many Native American activists confronted, challenged, and began to counteract. And this is the ideology and vision of Native America that guided and undergirded federal policy. And so I don't have time actually to fully sketch this amazing generation of Native American activists, but they include the Dakota author Ezekiel Asa, also known as Gertrude Bottom, who began publishing a series of important stories and eventually texts compiled together, as we can see above us, that I particularly targeted what she termed the, quote, institutional incompetence of the federal government. As she would write in American Indian Stories, government fraud of Indian, quote, lands, mines, oil fields, and other natural resources was as commonplace as it was illegal. Such mismanagement, she concluded, is, quote, almost beyond the possibility of comprehension. She was active within a society founded in 1911 called the Society of American Indians, which was within which the Oneida Indian activist and intellectual and reformer named Laura Cornelius Kellogg was really the society's primary organizer. And they held their first organizational meetings in her Wisconsin home in the summer of 1911 and had a national meeting in Columbus on Columbus Day of 1911 that brought together for the first time in American I'm sorry, for the first time in American history and Native American national political advocacy group. It included uh, dozens of leaders, and I will be focusing largely today on Kellogg, uh, an Ojibwe reformer from northern Minnesota by the name of Elizabeth Bendercloud, pictured here, as well as her Ho-Chunk partner by the name of Henry Rocloud, who grew up on the Winnebago Reservation in Nebraska, sent to boarding school. They're all boarding school educated. And it's one of the ironies of this period is that the boarding schools that were trained to assimilate Native Americans, and in fact, produced a generation of activists who sought to destroy them. Rocloud eventually met Elizabeth Bendercloud at one of the Society of American Indian meetings in the early, I think, 1914. And he established a preparatory school in Wichita called the American Indian Institute, which was founded in 1915. It differed in shape and form from the boarding schools that he and others had experienced. It offered advanced academics, those we'll see shortly, culturally enriched pedagogy, and it lasted until the Depression crippled its viability to expand, as well as it began admitting women. Collectively, this generation offered affirmative visions of what it meant to be a Native American person that envisioned Indians not as objects of victimization, but as agents of historical change. In doing so, this generation challenged the grammar of white supremacy while laying the foundations for the reforms that are known generally as the Indian New Deal, which started to come into effect following the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. Okay, I don't have time to really sketch all of these activities, but I'm going to focus very briefly on Kellogg Rocloud and conclude with a Wallapai Indian veteran and leader from World War One named Fred Mahone. And I do so to kind of highlight these individuals' varied capacities, and also to underscore how these individuals, um, collectively as well as individually, essentially inform the political policies and formations that eventually came to govern them. And they did so often in unwelcoming and violent institutional settings. And most historians, when they talk about this period, often are still prone to emphasize the achievements of the federal officials who eventually set in motion these reforms. This most famous commissioner in American Indian history is John Collier, who presided over four uh, uh, terms of the Roosevelt administration as commissioner and saw the implementation of so many of these policies and practices of reform. And he was joined by a very famous solicitor from the Department of Interior by the name of Felix Cohen, who is widely regarded as the most important legal scholar of American Indian or federal Indian law ever, because in 1941 he compiled the first publication of what is known as the Handbook of Federal Indian Law. Because beforehand, as you can imagine from those ideologies that we just looked at, Native Americans weren't seen to have much law or history or literature or culture or art worth kind of assessing. So these are kind of foundational figures, but I'm going to kind of briefly suggest that people like Henry Rocloud, Elizabeth Bendercloud, and Fred Mahone and Laura Cornelia Kellogg all had a kind of particular generative influence upon these policies and individuals. Kellogg was the most kind of, we might say, radical by our terms. She aspired essentially to get indigenous land returned in ways that were uncommon and often controversial. Um, and I don't want to like make parallel historical comparisons, particularly in the short time that we have together. But in the early 20th century, African American political activists and leaders and civil rights members were also advocating often differing visions of how to respond essentially to these challenges that pervaded American society and race relations at the time. And there are kind of more radical and more accommodationists within that parallel or often congruent historical movements as well. So she's trying to raise money, for example, through the selling of little enrollment cards from individuals so that she can launch and others litigation efforts against particularly the state of New York for having seized lands from these indigenous nations. The Oneida Nation of Wisconsin migrated west from New York Territory in the 1820s and 30s, settling in and around Green Bay. Um, they are the most western at the time of the six nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, the oldest politically confederated community across the North American landscape that brings together different communities to respond to common challenges, doing so in accordance with sets of customs, practice, and values that predate European arrival. So she's particularly trying to organize and restore certain kind of governing practices within the community as well. Um, because this challenge of assimilation has brought so many impositions. There's a guy named Chris Pexa who may be coming to the festival tomorrow, I believe, who's written a lot about the kind of imposition of external forms of normativity or cultural expectations on Indigenous people. And so one of those is the kind of patriarchal um, value placed on things like private property, voting, marriage, and other forms of kind of gendered social practices and sociality that are not always concordant with indigenous family structures. And so, as part of the book, for example, mentions how multi-generational families are routinely evident across this reservation era, and how the federal government is trying to constantly like move grandparents out of the homes of Native peoples, and in this process of socializing them into a different kind of cultural form. And these are things that Native children would learn very evidently and often violently at boarding schools, where they were forced to conform to certain kind of structures of daily life, and girls would learn how to become domestics essentially, and often worked in white households as domestic laborers, and men would learn to farm. You know, it's a crazy idea trying to turn Indians into farmers, but that was the kind of ideology of American policy that was actually an embodiment of many of the ideas of their founders, who kind of were constantly aspiring to build an agrarian republic and always kind of perplexed how to bring Native Americans into it. So these are not like new challenges of the American historical experience. Very briefly, Henry Rocloud, who I mentioned very briefly, was one of the co-founders. He also graduated from Yale College in 1910. He's the first known graduate of, and here he is as a superintendent of the Umatilla Reservation, photographed in 1948, 49. Um, he could have done many things with his life. At Yale, for example, he graduated in the same class as a future senator from Ohio by the name of Robert Taft, who authored the Taft-Hartley Act of the 1940s and nearly became the Republican nominee for president in 1952. It went to second ballot in Chicago, and returning American general from Europe became the eventual nominee after he convinced his Republican colleagues and supporters from California that he would bring Californians into his administration. And so he had a running mate whose last name was Nixon, and eventually appointed a Supreme Court justice by the name of Warren, for both of whom were from California, and his name Dwight Eisenhower. So Robert Taft is no kind of inconsequential kind of member of for example, the fraternity of Yale alumni. Henry Rocloud was not just his friend; he was his debate partner, routinely winning tournaments in which Taft also competed. And they were close friends, essentially. And then on the yearbooks of the graduating class in 1910, each has a kind of a picture. And so we saw the yearbook's photo of Henry Rocloud. And at the bottom of the of the page is not just their photo and a little biography of them and the kind of curricular activities, there were extracurricular activities they were doing, but an home address. And Henry Rocloud had been sponsored. That's how he ended up going to moving east. He'd been sponsored by a missionary family known as the Rowe family, who he became very close to, often lived with. And so his home address is the Rowe family address. at the time. And each of these addresses is provided likely to keep the classmates in touch with one another so that they have a kind of familiarity, a long-standing. This is before texts and emails and social media and things. So it was actually very hard to stay in touch in these days. So people would write letters and so forth. And so I ask my students when I teach this subject, what do you think Robert Taft's home address was in 1910 when he graduated from college? And they kind of look around like, the name sounds familiar. I say, it's the most famous address in America, home address. They go, is that like 1 Central Park West or, Beverly Hills, 90210? No, it's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because Robert Taft's father, Howard, was the sitting U.S. president at the time. And so you can imagine, this Indian student from rural Nebraska who had been to boarding school kind of trying to find standing and inhabit this universe in which he found himself. And he could have done many things. He could have become a governing official. Taft had been the colonial governor of the Philippines. He could have followed or tried to follow his classmates into business or governance or politics. Instead, he decides to found a school for Indians because he understands that this kind of prevailing ideology of assimilation is so misguided that there has to be kind of an intervention at the most elemental level. And so he and Bender Cloud create an institute designed to educate American Indians differently. And he also travels and does sets of activities that we will only very briefly sketch. But he becomes one of the nation's leading American Indian educational reformers, essentially, who is constantly exposing, for example, problems like those he found here in South Dakota as he reported from South Rosebud Reservation. He traveled widely on behalf of the Indian Service, often investigating problems within reservation communities and offering reports therein. When he visited Rosebud, South Dakota's boarding school, for example, he noticed that the conditions were awful and the punishment severe. Student runaways were common. Before he arrived, for example, several boys had recently, quote, froze to death by running away. 3 girls had also run away, and upon their return, one was made to, quote, carry a ball and chain around her ankle, while another was, quote, pushing a wheelbarrow for hours in front of the school. This was the educational world that he had experienced and now was also seeing as an adult. And breaking that punitive structure of education was imperative. Sadly for the Rowe family, the Institute didn't survive the Depression, but he took an appointment as the superintendent of Haskell Indian Institute, then the largest nation's boarding school. So he's working within the system as opposed to Kellogg Cornelius, who was often trying to work against it, so to speak. And at Haskell, he expanded upon the philosophies that he developed in Wichita over the previous decades. In his first act, he closed the Haskell jail, which had been used for decades, actually, to imprison Native American children. He also dismissed school employees known for harsh discipline and distanced Haskell from the local National Guard unit, which had supplied uniforms and officers and drilling equipment that were so cherished by the military leaders who had founded Carlisle. Located in Lawrence, Kansas, he also cultivated relationships with nearby educational institutions, including the University of Kansas. And by 1935, after 24 months as superintendent of this Indian boarding school, 28 Haskell graduates had gained admission to the University of Kansas. He's best known for his activities in reforming federal policy in the late stages of this assimilation era, and joins a famous report presented to Congress called The Problem of the Indian Administration, also referred to often as the Merrim Report, as we might be able to see as who was the technical director of the survey staff. This essentially group of investigators toured Indian country, examined the disastrous policies of the federal government, and reported the most scathing rebuke of federal Indian policy ever authored. And it set in motion then the ideological tenor and reforms that followed in what we call the Indian New Deal. in which the most important legislative actions of the federal government to essentially reverse a century or so of designed policies to uh, remove and or I mean, I don't want to use the word destroy, but severely unravel tribal capacities. Um, um, they began doing essentially reform efforts for the first time that were targeted to not essentially um, undermine cultural and political autonomy within reservation communities. This includes the famous Indian Reorganization Act, 1934, and a series of other initiatives. And I'm going to briefly, very, very, very briefly conclude with the last two, we call the Indian Claims Commission Act, 1946, and Cohen's Handbook. We already kind of introduced Cohen, kind of said he's the kind of founding figure of the field of federal Indian law, and his handbook is still constantly used by Indian legal scholars and lawyers and students to kind of try to understand this very complex doctrine of federal constitutional practice. He authored the handbook the same year the Supreme Court held a case. And here's our Wallapai veteran by the name of Fred Mahone, who adorns the cover of a very important book called Making Indian Law that came out not too long ago, 2007. And like I said earlier, I'm bringing together this book streams of academic findings that so many others like Macmillan and I didn't mention this. Sorry that my understandings of Elizabeth Bender Cloud and Henry Rowe Cloud are gleaned almost entirely from a joint biography written by their granddaughter, Rainier Ramirez, who authored a book not too long ago with the University of Nebraska Press. Some of you may know the University of Nebraska Press, like the University of Oklahoma Press. These are the two leading publishers of Native American history. And so it's not uncommon to see these titles across these footnotes and citations. So Rainier Ramirez authored a book called Standing Up to Colonial Power about her grandparents' lives and legacies. And Christian Macmillan has written, essentially the definitive history of this Wallapai land case, which very few people up until the publication of this book had ever heard of. And so this is one of the perhaps joys or attributes of historical inquiry is that really profound historical analysis can make something that seems uh, unfamiliar or familiar, or can kind of invert understandings of subject matters that are kind of surprising and often unanticipated. And so Cohen publishes his Handbook of Federal Indian Law the same year he's litigating this case on behalf of the Wallapai Indians of Arizona. There are 22 federally recognized tribes in Arizona, all of whom I think are on the map that we saw earlier. Some are better known than others, right? The Navajo Nation, the largest nation, Indian nation in the country. Um, some of the smaller tribes are less known, and that's very common across Indian country, academically or intellectually speaking. So the Wallapai are not a well-known tribe either. They're along the Colorado River. And this book just kind of just extraordinarily kind of changed my understandings of this period because Fred Mahone is a is a U.S. World War I veteran who returns from service in 1918 and writes a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that says the U.S. President has, quote, set aside and reserved the use and occupancy of this land for the Wallapai Indians. It is our desire to make this reservation our everlasting home for ourselves and future generations. 1918. He's saying, this is our homeland that we want to preserve for future generations. No assimilation in his mind, right? Um, there's a great deal of activism in this period after the First World War that eventually will set in motion the passage, finally, of the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which we just celebrated or are celebrating the 100th anniversary of. Actually, citizenship is not a real priority for many of these reservation leaders. They understand that it will help them over time, but the real priorities are often reforms within this system and and challenging those extractive land and assimilation policies. Okay, so what happens? Well, this reservation was established by an executive order. So there's no treaty, and it's in Arizona at a time established in 1883 when there were very, very few non-Indian settlers or residents in the state. So the federal government is setting aside essentially lands for native peoples, but over time, of course, non-native peoples come, as do non-native corporations. At the time, the largest corporations in America, this is before U.S. Steel, are railroads. And so the railway, you can't probably see this on the map, but the map is kind of strangely kind of configured that has the Wallapai Reservation as well as other reservations, and the kind of bordered line is a kind of explanation of their kind of Aboriginal uh, like domain, their pre-reservation lifestyles. But the reservation itself, we might be able to not quite sense, is bisected by not just a road, but also a train, organized, run by the Santa Fe Railway Company, which previously was known as the U.S. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company, which laid its first tracks on the reservation in 1883. They essentially usurped the reservation lands and took the water resources upon it for their trains. And the Wallapai couldn't use the waters that they historically had used for their orchards and gardens and had to pay the railway essentially to use them. They found this unjust, illegal, but couldn't really do anything about it. This guy does something about it, just like Henry Rocloud did something about it, just like Laura Cornelius Kellogg did something about it, among others. So he begins organizing a litigation strategy that you wouldn't believe me if I told you what happened. He enlists these powerful federal officials in Washington. He writes letters, eventually sets in motion Cohen's legal advocacy. Cohen was appointed to the Interior as solicitor without any familiarity with Indian affairs. But he quickly learns that there is this kind of large doctrine of cases and rulings and precedents and policies that very few people actually have ever learned. And so he's starting to bring them together. And he's doing so in part because there's a case coming out of Arizona in which the Wallapai are saying, these are our lands, not their lands. And the Wallapai are saying, we want them back or we want some compensation for their taking. And then the government has this division, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that's supposed to be advocating on behalf of tribes. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs essentially begins to investigate, inquire, and learn about this situation. And eventually the Department of Interior will file a case against the Department of Justice on behalf of the federal government will file a case against the railway. That's why all these cases are like USV, because the United States government is essentially suing often on behalf of the tribes, but not always. Sometimes they're suing the tribes themselves, as we may know. So this case comes before the Supreme Court of the United States in December of 1941, and they offer a unanimous verdict that this tribe has rights to their land, and they're not like endless wanderers or constant migrants or peoples without law or history or government. They have a right to that land known as Aboriginal title that has been articulated since the founding by the first and earliest Supreme Courts of the United States. And even though the tribe has been diminished in size and standing, they still are entitled to this Aboriginal title. And since they have that right and somebody else has infringed upon it, they are entitled to some compensation for it. That compensation becomes the Indian Claims Commission Act. The federal government says, or the Supreme Court says, this is a problem. Congress, go fix it. And the crazy thing about this ruling, the reason why no one ever heard about it, it was decided on December 8th of 1941. And so, like so many moments in Indian country, so many moments of this history, no one knew about it. It's not in the newspapers. It's not, nothing else is happening in America except this small thing that happened on December 7th and 8th. And now Roosevelt is walking across the Capitol and basically giving an address to Congress says, we are at war. So all of a sudden, the Indian affairs, of course, are no longer a national priority. And so this case just lay dormant. But this Claims Commission Act, which finally gets passed, it's one of the last acts Cohen does in his role in the interior. This Commission Claims Act gets passed, and the Wallapai and over 100 other tribes seek compensation and restitution for the illegal taking of their lands. Whoa. When I teach this, I ask my students, did Fred Mahone create the Indian Claims Commission Act? After a while, they say, it looks like it. Without him, this doesn't happen. Maybe some other tribe would have found a mechanism but maybe they wouldn't have had Cohen. They may not have had the same team behind them. And it's a very changed court by the time the war is over. Um, and it nicely, I think, concludes not just an analysis of this World War II or New Deal era, but it opens up an introduction to the post-war era. And that's the conclusion. That's the last chapter of the book is on the post-war and Cold War era when the Claims Commission Act is beginning to take some steam. But the federal leaders in Washington are saying, we've been running this government the way we have for 20 years, and we're tired of all this bureaucracy, all these kind of increased resource commitments. Let's start, bringing more austerity and creating different kind of visions of governance that are different from the Roosevelt or New Deal. We're no longer in the Depression. The war is over. Let's enjoy the prosperity of the American economy. And when they look to Indian affairs, they start saying things like, you guys are somehow beleaguered, and um, we've tried all these things. Maybe we should just not, recognize your reservations anymore. Let's start terminating them. And so that's the policy of the 50s, as some of you may know. So in the 50s, the federal government adopts another assimilation design, but not of children in the same way. They decide they're going to not recognize tribal sovereignty, and tribes that are actually filing these claims before the government, for them to actually get compensated at times, the federal government says you have to, or federal officials say you have to accept the termination of their tribe. And that happens among the Klamath and among the Menominee and many other tribes. And so a new era of kind of challenges comes into form that includes also the one-way migration of Native American people to urban environments through a program called relocation. And all of these are designed efforts to essentially undermine the capacity of tribal communities to govern themselves. Some suggest there's an attempt to alienate reservation resources as well, but it's really more of an ideological, to a second extent, political kind of challenge. And so tribal members respond to that, as we may know well here in South Dakota, by initiating sets of militancies and occupations, as well as reservation activism that eventually lead to a new era that concludes the book and that we're still living in, called American Indian Self-Determination. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it and look forward to a lively potential conversation and potential conversations in person hereafter. Thank you so much. Perfect.